Welcome back. The time is 2 minutes before the top of the hour, 9. And in a bit, we'll be having our hashtag heard on air. This is from Wednesday Nights with Inayat Wadi, a really, really important and pivotal conversation that he had with a range of, I think, prominent and very, very, I think, really good, panel of people that he had on his show yesterday on Wednesday nights with the Inayat Wadi. And the focus was the humanitarian situation in Gaza 1 year on. And in the panel, he had Professor Atta Hindi. He's the editor of Palestine's Yearbook of International Law. He also had Huwaida Arraf, the co-founder of International Solidarity Movement, and also Mohamed Elmaazi, editor-in-chief at Defense Truth. And these people brought in very, very important insights as we reviewed the year that was, and as this genocide against the people of Gaza, perpetuated by the Israeli occupying forces, entered its second year. So take a listen. Hashtag heard on air. It was yesterday on Wednesday nights with Inayat Wadi. Really, really important conversation.
Sure. I mean, I was speaking with a few people a few hours ago only about how the same story can be written 10 different ways, depending on who's writing it, their worldview. What's important is not just what you say and how you say what you say, but also what you don't say. And quite often in the case of Palestine, what is lacking is context. So it's merely the words that are used to describe Palestinian casualties as opposed to, say, Zionist casualties, but it's also the historical context. So for many people that will criticize me on social media, they'll talk about how people are often brought to think that everything has just begun just at the latest instance of violence. Like history began on October 7th last year. And here are examples of where context is missing. So when South Africa was presenting its case at the International Court of Justice, the BBC did not live stream it, nor did they present regular updates or briefings on it. But when the Israeli government was representing its side the following day, they did live stream the entire event. Another example would be that, I don't know how many of your viewers or listeners will be aware, but it was revealed in a leaked memo that was written about at The Intercept, which is an investigative site in the United States, that the New York Times was instructing its journalists to avoid certain terms when covering Israel's war on Gaza, which include terms such as genocide, ethnic cleansing, occupied territory, and outside of, quote, except in very rare cases, end quote, the term refugee camps, for example, to describe areas that displaced Palestinians lived in, or even the word Palestine. So how do you then report on what's going on? You can report on what's going on, but when you exclude key information, so for example, this is in most respects, if not all respects, an anti-colonial struggle. And yet how many people will you find in Britain that are aware that Israel was founded literally on top of Palestine, that Israel was founded by settler colonialists? It puts things into a very different perspective, and that's quite often what is missing and what is lacking in terms of the mainstream media or establishment media reporting, both in Britain, the United States, but also elsewhere, such as in Canada and many countries on the European continent. So it helps. I think the ultimate objective is to use an often quoted expression to manufacture consent for support for Israel's genocide, without, of course, calling it a genocide. They would never actually describe it as a genocide here, although they will say that others have described it as a genocide.
Yes, and Professor Nidal, we've had this discussion previously, and earlier on, when this genocide had begun unfolding, you made a very telling comment, and that comment was Gaza and Gaza having the potential of actually changing the world, defining what a new world would look like, what a new world order would look like. And as we now head into the second year of this genocide, and just in terms of these views that you actually hold, and to a large extent, Huwaida made reference to the millions of people right across the entire world have actually come to terms with the ugly truth of this genocide, with the ugly truth of the Zionist regime, of supremacism, of racism, all of this at the end of the day. And it has actually exposed this world in a very, very horrific manner. And at the same time, the hypocrisy of this world as well. And just to talk around, that comment that you had made and what has been achieved a year later. If you could unmute your mic, please, Prof.
What a difference a year makes. The situation before October 7 is nothing, or the world after October 7 is nothing like the world before. Even though the genocide has been going on for over 100 years, however, the world got accustomed to it. The narrative around the world has very much bought into Israel as a legitimate entity, and they forgot about what the problem is, what the root cause is, what the Palestinian reality is, the definition of what Palestine and Palestinians. The word Palestine has disappeared from the vocabulary and the maps, and even the public and political and official discourse in the region and around the world. Gaza came with October 7 to change all that and to create no less than a revolution in the world on so many levels, on the level of the grassroots, of the public conscience, on the world realization that there is something called Palestine, the root causes of the problem, the harsh reality of occupation. Nobody around the world now can ignore what Palestine is. Nobody around the world does not understand what Palestinian suffering and 100 years of genocide in Palestine is. So this is a major big accomplishment. There is no amount that you can place on it, how much resources or money in the world that can ever create the difference that, alhamdulillah, we have seen in 1 year. So that's on one level. On the other level is, we know that all the countries who are siding with Israel, what I call the axis of evil, these are all genocidal countries. These are all countries that have a very bloody history, and they lack actually legitimacy from the foundation. The US is a genocidal nation that was based upon ethnic cleansing of the natives. We know the story. But even if you look at the European supporters of so-called Israel, they all have like a bloody terrorist history, and all of this credibility or legitimacy or morality, ethical standing that they ever claimed, it all just came down in just one day on October 7. I mentioned before that Gaza is not only creating a revolution, Gaza is actually reshaping the new world after October 7. We saw how Gaza, and actually I use the word that Sinwar is actually the one who's calling the shots on who's going to be the president or who's going to be leading those governments of the axis of evil. We saw how they impacted the elections in France. We saw how they impact the elections in UK. And definitely it's Sinwar and Abu Ubaida that are going to be calling the shots on who's going to be the US president in about 3 weeks or 4 weeks or more. There is something that I think is going to be coming to, like, people are going to start to realize very soon. So-called Israel, which I never recognized Israel, I never consider Israel a state. Israel is not a state. By political science, by legal, by even UN, a country to be considered a state, legitimate state, has to have three characters, and Israel does not meet any of them. In 1947, Israel rejected a UN proposal for what would have been the borders of Israel. So Israel does not have defined borders, which is the first condition to be a state. Israel lacks a constitution, like a written constitution. That's the other condition that Israel doesn't meet. And Israel does not have homogeneous population. That's why they try to call it Jewish state and create so-called the Jewish identity to define the population of Israel. So in many ways, what October 7th, that it exposed to us that Israel is not a state to start with. It is a criminal genocidal organization supported by criminal genocidal quote-unquote nations or so-called countries and so forth. And this is really going very deep in the conscious of the world, in the conscious of humans all over the world. There is, if you go to any country around the world right now and you try to create some sort of survey of the public opinion in those countries, you're going to find, like, alhamdulillah, I mean, Israel today is probably the most despised entity in the world. And there's almost like unanimous consensus around the world reflected by the voting in the General Assembly and so forth in favor of the state of Palestine and so forth. So today, at least, we're getting recognition of state of Palestine in terms of like political terms. But I think very soon that state of Palestine is going to be in the world conscious as the entire Palestine from the river to the sea.
Yes, and to bring Professor Atta into the discussion. Professor Atta, now you spent a large part of your life or your career working on international law, looking at human rights, particularly looking at the Middle East, looking at North Africa. So you understand the dynamics from an international law perspective very, very well. But what the last year has also exposed is the failure of the world to understand, to truly understand or to grasp what international law is all about. And we've seen this come to the fore when South Africa took the case to the ICJ, when we've seen all of this international law come actually under the radar as well. And just to look at it from a legal perspective and what has been achieved as a result of this genocide, and what does this actually mean for international law in general, particularly when we have a genocide unfolding, particularly when we see humanity or human beings being dehumanized in the manner that the people of Palestine have been.
Thank you again for having me. I mean, some of the other speakers have already kind of somewhat answered that question, and I think at the very least, like from the civil society perspective, as far as Palestine is concerned, international law, I think we understand that international law is not going to emancipate us. International law is but a tool of many other tools, including popular resistance and other types of tools that might be available that in some way will contribute to achieving justice and accountability for Palestine and the Palestinian people. So we work within international law, understanding that it's somewhat of a paradox in the sense that international law is born of colonialism and imperialism, but also that that vice versa as well, is that it was kind of a circular effect, and that it gave rise to colonialism and imperialism at the same time. And the way it works in the international plane is not necessarily going to be beneficial. Any one of us can have a discussion on international law with respect to Palestine, and it's generally an easy debate in terms of the rules and how they should be interpreted or applied. And eventually what we'll see is just arguments that basically fall along the lines of hypocrisy and double standards. I mean, that's the way it is, and that's the way it is, as some of the other speakers have rightfully mentioned, in terms of the way certain states, and particularly in the West, approach issues of international law. And it's not only because, it's not really because there's really a problem with the rules, but it's a problem of how we view one another and the demonization of the Palestinian people, and the extension of, in many ways, American policy within the region, which has been going on. We have to look at this in the context of what's been going on in the Arab world for the past several decades. If we look at Iraq, if we look at Libya, if we look at everything, justice and accountability issues aside in terms of the politics. if these efforts to go to international mechanisms, we go to them not necessarily with the guarantee that it's going to do something for us, but it's a process, right? South Africa was also a process in that sense, and many other states were also a process in that sense. But we liken ourselves in many ways to South Africa. For the ICJ in the genocide case and the provisional measures, the court finds itself in a very difficult situation. Is that they have a history with certain states, and they also understand that if the court makes certain legal determinations, which it should, or as much is clear, not to say that the provisional measures were great in many senses in terms of what Israel was supposed to do, but it didn't maybe go far enough. And as my colleague Rabia Akhbaria has said, and I'm going to paraphrase, is that we'll talk about the genocide after the blood or the ink has run dry, right? But for now, in order to ensure, I guess, the legitimacy of that court, and these are binding opinions that states have to agree to, it seems somewhat that the court is at least slightly more conservative, recognizes, of course, that there is a plausible case of genocide. And then if you look at the advisory opinion on the International Court of Justice, from the International Court of Justice on the legality of the occupation, something that I have written on in more detail, and there's quite a bit of scholarship on this, is that it's something that we have been saying for years, is that the occupation is illegal. It's always been illegal because of its denial or its violation of certain top rules of international law, peremptory norms of international law, denial of the right to self-determination, annexation, and others, racial discrimination, apartheid. And in many ways, it was almost taboo, like you couldn't talk about these issues, even though there was a legal basis to do so. And this is kind of what goes back to the issues of censorship and all that stuff, is that a lot of individuals don't want to talk about it, even if you have what is a very valid legal argument. And many of us, in my field have experienced that. But at the very least, the court there, knowing it's that they have a little bit more room to speak to what the law actually is, said that the occupation is illegal and called for Israel to withdraw its military and civilian presence. Is that going to happen overnight? No, but I think it certainly gets us in the right direction. Is that the law is starting to shape itself, and particularly as global power shifts back to the global South, Africa, Asia, we'll start seeing that that freedom is near. When is that going to happen? I can't predict, but I think it's close.